Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. The United Church of Christ celebrates its 50th anniversary this year, and with us to talk about that significant event is Karen Winkel, pastor of the United Church of Paducah on Buckner Lane. Welcome to the program.
Good to be here, Barry.
Explain to our viewers a little bit about the history of this church. The way you put it previously was that you're a newcomer with a very old tradition.
Well, our denomination, as you said, is celebrating its 50th anniversary this summer, but our roots go back to the beginning of this nation, even before it was a nation. Our roots go back into England and back into Germany, and the folks that were first here, the Pilgrims and the Puritans, I think of them as our grandparents. That's the English side of the family. And then on the German side, the children of the Reformation looked to this nation and saw as it was beginning that it had a need for clergy. And so in the 1700s and then in the 1800s, started sending ministers to the United States to meet the needs of a new country. And so there's this German piece that runs through. Those also are our grandparents, our antecedents, and so we have.
That's the evangelical and reformed.
Tradition, yes, and so those two mighty rivers come together, and in 1957 there was a kind of a formal uniting of those traditions in what is the United Church of Christ, and that was a risky thing. I think. Probably we don't appreciate enough the cultural differences between the English and the Germans. We think of them all, well, they're all on the other side of the pond. But that really was a courageous thing in that time, in the late 50s, to come together like that. And they did that really with no certainty that it would be a relationship that would succeed. But it was born of a deep, deep conviction that Christ's church is called to unity. And our motto is taken from John's Gospel, that they might all be one, which was Jesus' prayer just before he died. And so folks in the 40s and 50s there was a very strong ecumenical movement in the United States overall, but folks really were taking that very seriously, and so some conversations started. What would happen if we came together? And so they did. I didn't know much about that until I went to seminary and was given an assignment to read a number of articles about the lead up to that union, and I felt like I was reading about my grandparents, and I didn't realize how much conviction went into that and how uncertain they were really about whether this would succeed, but they felt that was the faithful thing to do. And 50 years later, we still are struggling with what it means to be faithful in that way. But we are a denomination because of that happened 50 years ago. We're very committed to ecumenical relationships, and we're a denomination that's always seeking to be in relationship in meaningful ways with others in the Christian family. So not always are we understood, because we're a denomination that has taken some stands that have been controversial or early. We've come out early on matters of justice and social equality.
What are some of those issues?
Well, we were going back to the English side of the history of the church. We were the first church to ordain an African American man. We were the first church to ordain a woman. That was over 100 years ago. We were also the first church to ordain a gay person, and that was in 1972. So even now in 2007, folks are struggling with even what to do with parishioners who are gay. And our denomination took what was a very early stand on that. And I didn't know this. There's a little piece that is interesting to me on a personal level. The minister who started the church that I grew up in was the pastor who sponsored that young man, Bill Johnson, when he when he felt a call to ordain ministry. Now, Henry wasn't the pastor at my church at that time, but he and I are friends now, and he got death threats on a regular basis for that. But our denomination, I think every denomination has a distinct call, just like ministers and lay people have distinct calls to ministry. I think denominations do too. They have something that God is asking us to do and be in the world, and I think our denomination is called to respond early and maybe give others courage in matters of justice and social equality. So,
my tradition is Presbyterian, which is hierarchical, as is the Methodist tradition, the Catholic tradition. Explain how a Congregationalist system works.
Well, it's a little different, and that's from the English side of the house. The power exists, all the decision-making power exists at the level of the local church. And even within a local church, that power resides in the congregation. So I'm in covenant with my congregation, and all the local churches are in covenant with our denomination, but no one in the headquarters in Cleveland can tell any local church what to do. So it's we choose to be in relationship with each other, but we're also autonomous. So we have covenant and autonomy. And so the local church decides who their pastor is going to be. They vote on matters of importance. They vote the council into being. I serve really with the affirmation of the congregation. But if they decided that I was no longer the gal for them, then they would gather together and have a vote, and out I'd go. But no one from any regional office could step in and tell them what to do. So it's a very different way of proceeding. It's really, rather than a pyramid, it's flipped so that where the major decisions come from is the local church. We gather every other year for a general synod where decisions are made and some proclamations. That's a national meeting, but none of the proclamations that are voted in are ones that any local church must endorse. So it's a very different way to operate.
Does your church have creedal statements? The Presbyterian Church has the Nicene Creed and the various creeds. Is that part of your tradition as well?
Yes, and we consider those testimonies of faith, but we don't have any tests of faith. So when we say those creeds, we understand that we're saying we believe, and yet each person within the reciting of those creeds is free to understand them however they will. So we don't have, when somebody comes forward to join the church, we have, three things that we ask as they covenant with us to share their gifts, and we with them to receive those gifts. Do you believe in God? Do you believe in Jesus Christ? Do you believe in the Holy Spirit? We're a Trinitarian denomination, but how each person even believes those things is up to them, and that's part of the heritage from the Congregationalists, from the English side of the house, which is it is a gift of God to have a heart and a mind and a life with God, and so we each come in our own way to understand how God is at work in the world within us and calling us to serve. So we have quite a bit of latitude in the way that we believe, and that would be very reflective of my congregation. I would have, if I were to put people on some sort of spectrum, we'd have a pretty broad spectrum. So that's one of the things that I enjoy about serving the church is everyone is invited to use their own heart and their own mind and to invest in prayer and reflection and study and come to understand in their own way. So that's hugely liberating for me as a preacher, because I'm giving everyone something to take home and use in their own reflecting. I'm not telling them what to think.
What fascinates me about the UCC is you go back to your English Puritan roots. Those are some pretty stern, pretty strict folks. I'd like to, if I may, read you this poem. It's called Day of Doom. This is a Puritan poem. And it goes like this. They cry, they roar for anguish sore, and gnaw their tongues for horror. But get away without delay. Christ pities not your cry. Depart to hell, there may you yell and roar eternal lie. So the UCC has come a long way from that. Getting back to the Congregationalist idea, is that also from the German tradition? You were talking about the Evangelical Reform. Were they also Congregational?
I don't know so much about their, the word for that is polity, their way of going about things, although I do think that the pastor had a lot more authority than the pastor did on the congregational side. And the church that I serve has German roots, and so I feel that, just the remnants of that. But how they went about governing themselves, I'm less familiar with, because I'm a child of the English side.
And you think about going back to the New England colonies, the New England town meeting, which was, that's almost like Greek direct democracy. Let's all get together and show of hands on this, and that comes out of the church. Now, your background, you grew up in California.
I did.
In the
United Church of Christ.
United Church of Christ, and went to seminary where?
I went to seminary at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, and I went after a career working at Cal State Fresno, the university that was in the city where I grew up, and kind of fell into a marvelous career there that was perfect preparation for ministry, but I didn't know it at the time.
And that was what?
I worked with international students largely, and it was just a perfect kind of job for me. I felt so fortunate. I could never believe that I was really getting paid for what I did, and not very many people can say the world comes to them, but we had students from 80 different countries. We had a really strong staff and very collaborative. So when I went off to seminary, I had already, I think, the kind of background in collaborative effort and kind of trusting the Spirit, because that was how we worked together as a staff. That is something that informs the way that I think about ministry. So I went to seminary and started in fall of '94 and graduated in spring of '98. And
that's quite a career change. That's interesting.
Well, it's not anything that I sought. In fact, when I felt called to ministry, I was away from the institution of the church. I'd actually left it. I loved the church that I grew up in, but it was predominantly intellectual in its approach, and I felt that was not sufficient for me. And so I went on a quest to seek after what it was I was yearning for. And what I say to folks is that I felt like I was on an outbound train, but I think the track had just a very slight curve. So a number of years later, as the train's coming into the station, I thought, well, it's coming into the station of the church. This isn't what I was envisioning at all. I thought I was not going to be going back to the institution of the church. And it was kind of, I think God has a marvelous sense of humor. So I think for me, it's kind of funny that I would feel a call to ministry while I was away from the church.
Don't you see a lot of people when they're young and they're kids, they go to church and then they get away from it, and then when they become middle-aged and have kids, they sort of come back. Isn't that's a fairly common phenomenon, I guess?
Yeah, for me it was quite purposeful, though, the leaving. Yeah. I felt angry when I went to church, and so I thought, this isn't good. I need to investigate what that anger is, and it really...
What was the anger?
For me, the anger was that I didn't want to live in my head. And the church that I grew up in was a church that served the university community. So we had a lot of really bright and marvelous and faithful people. But I don't think that, for me, faith is sustained by intellect only. And I was really looking for a relationship with a living God, and I didn't feel like the church was teaching me how to get that. The church was teaching me some marvelous skills for thinking about God, but how do I relate to God? Almost how do I breathe God? And my nature's maybe a little I'm not so much a theologian. Maybe I'm a little bit more the mystical type, and so that's what I was looking for, was the experiential piece, and so I sought that in a variety of ways.
Now, the seminary you attended, is that a UCC seminary?
Yes,
Yes.
It was the first UCC-related seminary west of the Mississippi. And it was a marvelous place to go to school because it was, or is, part of a network of other seminaries. And they call that neighborhood really Holy Hill, because, if you're enrolled, then you call it Holy Hell. But we had a Lutheran school, a Presbyterian school, Jesuit, Franciscan, Dominican, Unitarian, American Baptist, a Center for Jewish Studies, a Center for Buddhist Studies, almost all of those schools within walking distance, and and many other institutes related to, various things related to religion. So my requirement was only that I take a third of my classes from my own school. And so for somebody that grew up in a denomination with strong ecumenical values, it was a great place for me. And the education really wasn't so much in the content, it was in relating with folks from these different backgrounds. I could feel the faith of the Lutherans, for example. There was something about that when I went to the Lutheran school to take church history. I could feel how culturally they were different than my own peers from the UCC. And when I took a class with the Jesuits, I could feel the difference there. And that had a very powerful effect on me. I don't know that I would be able to really describe it, but it did. As I understand now that we bring more than ideas about faith to our relationships with one another, but indeed a culture, a shaping that happens.
Did you take any classes at the Presbyterian Seminary?
No, and the reason that I didn't, it's not that I didn't want to, but they were on the other side of the bay, and I didn't want to commute over there.
Well, I was going to say you might have felt chilly. I mean, they're the frozen chosen, of course.
Well, I've heard that said of a number of denominations, but there were some good classes going on over there.
Yeah. No, I think that's interesting. There's I've known a number of ministers who become ministers fairly late in life, here in Paducah and elsewhere. They have different careers, and it's interesting when you think about that you did something. And I think personally, that makes a person a better minister, because you haven't. Well, people look at ministers sometimes as these very holy, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And how do you feel about that? If some ministers are just almost like they're just sort of like, I don't know, godly or something. And
well, that would be the minister that I interned with, who I've told people, if you want to know what Jesus was like, then you go meet Charles. He's extremely humble, but very Christ-like. And that isn't because he's trying, it's because that's who he is. But I tell people I wasn't called to the ministry because of my virtue or even because of my faith. I think I was called because I wrestle a lot with what it means to be a Christian. And there are many people that I can minister to effectively because I share, many of the questions and many of the struggles that they do. I think it's natural for church folk to put their minister on a pedestal, and I climb off of that as often as I can, and I really do want to lift up the call to ministry that exists within each layperson, because by virtue of our baptism we're all ministers. So I try to get off that pedestal. I try to be as flawed as I can, if that sounds like a worthy pursuit, because I really want people to understand that there's nothing about me that's any different than what's alive in them. It's just that I've been asked, I feel, by God to do a few things in particular, but everything else I want lay folks to know they can do. So I try to affirm those ministries.
Well, you mentioned the term wrestling with one's faith, which is a very Presbyterian concept as well. But some denominations find that frightening. There's a bumper sticker that says, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. How do you react to that?
Well, I think of the minister who took great interest in me when I was in high school, who was a member of my church. She wasn't the pastor there, but she took interest in me. I think she knew that I was kind of a little bit of a theologian, quite a bit of a mystic. And she said to me a number of times, as we would talk, she'd seek me out to ask what I was thinking or what questions might I be asking. And she said something that's really affected me and affected my ministry, which is the greatest act of faith is to question. And that can be understood in a variety of ways, but ultimately I think that's a theological statement that says God has nothing to defend. So we're free to ask whatever we will, because God's not afraid of the questions that we ask. God isn't afraid of us using our hearts and our minds, our life experience, to ask important questions so that we can freely come to understanding. And the mark of a healthy relationship is the ability to talk about anything. Anything can go on the table. It's not a healthy relationship when someone says, well, we're not going to talk about that. Then you know you're in a relationship that needs some work, needs some liberation. And I think Penny helped me see that, God says if it's important to you, it's important to me. So let's wrestle with this. And certainly that's been my journey with God. There have been a number of things that I haven't been able to claim as my own without quite a bit of wrestling, and God's let me struggle for a long time with something and let me think things that might seem controversial if I were to speak them out loud, but I felt God giving me complete permission to do that. And so I think that our faith is enormously strengthened by asking questions and viewing that question asking as a holy pursuit. That's part of our relating with God. It isn't something that we have to hide from God. God welcomes it. God has nothing to defend.
And as far as we know, we're the only creature on earth that has the ability to think and reason. And if one's a religious person, you could say, well, God gave you that brain, maybe you should use it. But again, lots of times people are very afraid to talk about these issues. That it's
well, and we need support. We need that modeled for us, many of us. And I think that's one of the important things in the church that I grew up in, where folks did use their minds and did call upon their intellect. Was nothing was off limits for us to think or express or to wrestle with. So there was that's certainly a gift that I received that not everybody gets, which is a celebration of that capacity that we have to think. Just for me, I needed something more, which was heart.
Well, so if someone wanted to come to your church on Sunday, do you give a 2-hour sermon or?
No.
I didn't think you would.
I might if I thought I could get away with it. No, I'll preach for maybe 15 or 20 minutes. And
that's very good. I may interject. The minister who married us, Presbyterian, said he learned in seminary, you don't save any souls after 15 minutes, so get in and get out. And I said, I do appreciate that. All of my students, bless them, they're subjected to my 50-minute or hour and 15-minute lecture.
Yeah. Well, I'm not giving a lecture. And what I'm trying to do, I think, is educate a little bit, but engage people's imaginations, give people also a different way of looking at whatever it is that we're looking at. For people who grew up in the church, so often those passages are so familiar to us that they're not fresh. And so I'm always looking for the thing to offer to people that might put a different spin on it, just so that we can enter those things anew. So I ask myself every Sunday, kind of what's the standard sermon about this passage, and once I know what that is, then I know where to go, because I do try always to offer something a little different. But I'm not insisting that anybody agree with me. I'm just really asking that people take what I say seriously, but then take it home and pray over it and study and reflect on your own life and see if there's something there for you. So
questions are certainly welcome.
Oh, you bet. Yeah. Yeah, and I know when I preach that, not everybody's going to agree. But I grew up in a church where that wasn't expected, where actually we knew that people weren't going to agree, and that was part of living together as a community.
Mm-hmm. Do you also have the standard Sunday school and that, or how does that work?
Well, our Sunday school is a little intermittent. It depends on who wants what and when. So sometimes we have classes going, and sometimes we'll have programs going on in the evening. Or I'm a big believer in kind of one-on-one. So I do a lot of nurturing of learning and growing by just conversations with individuals. Partly because our church does have a rather broad spectrum of understanding about God. That personal approach, I think, is really effective because it does meet a person, right where they are, rather than have them feel in a group like they're different. Because probably when we get together in a group, many people are feeling like they're different. Mm-hmm.
How many members does your church have?
We have 70, 75 members, and on a typical Sunday we might have 50 people there. We have a number of folks that consider our church theirs, even though they've not, made the official membership statement, so I'm fine with that. I'm probably a little different in these parts. I'm not a big believer that people must join. I think sometimes a person needs 10 years to decide they're ready to join, but it needs to feel authentic rather than this is an expectation of the church. So, and that's something that the church understands. Even on our website, it says, you're not going to get any pressure to join. So we're very low key about that. I'm more interested in involvement.
Than on the dotted line.
Yeah.
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 We have less than a minute. You mentioned your website. Let's give the www thing.
UCCPaducah.org. That's all one word, UCCPaducah.org. And all my sermons are posted there for people that are a little nervous about what might be coming from the pulpit, and they can read and see that there's a lot of grace there and a lot of freedom to think. And it shows what we're up to, and we're up to all kinds of things, and trying to be faithful to what it is that God's asking us to do in this community, which is a little different than any other church. I think, as I said before, we each have a distinct call. That's true for individuals. That's true for individual churches and for denominations as well.
And we're almost out of time. The telephone number.
442-3722.
Area code 270.
270. Mm-hmm.
We're out of time. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
I'm Barry Craig. Our guest today was Karen Winkel of the UCC of Paducah. We will see you next time.